Hello everyone. So welcome to our lesson. Today we're going to be talking about the principles of assessment. That is fair. We'll start off with fairness. What is fairness? Refers to how students are treated before, during, and after an assessor apply an assessment method. What type of treatment do students receive from the assessor? Is it the same? Is the assessor also giving some students, for example, certain treatments that is not giving to other students. So that is what we're referring to as an assessment being fair. It also looks at removing any barrier that might affect how the students are going to attempt the assessment. And so the assessment shouldn't be biased in a manner that it's sort of like attacking some students, maybe either religiously or, for example, the race or the gender. So at least the assessment should be fair in a manner that at least it's not really attacking some student. For example, it's not talking bad about a certain gender, or it's not talking bad about a certain cultural context or background, for example, or the ability of certain students. So at least for an assessment to be fair, at least it should be neutral. So when one is setting an assessment, so it looks at all those things to say, is it bias? Is it free from bias? It's also in a sense that is it sensitive to the gender of all, either male or female or whatever that type of gender that you want to be sensitive to the race as well. But because you are going to have different types of students from different rates, then you also make sure that at least your assessment should not prioritize other students and other races, and then, for example, neglect others or talk bad about others. And then the cultural background also, is it, for example, bias in a sense that is talking maybe bad about a certain culture. So those are the things that we need to refer, to take note for our assessments to be fair. It also must be communicated clearly. Is really an assessment that is, are the students given clear instruction so that at least they understand what they're expected to do? Is it communicated accurately? For example, are the expectations communicated so that at least the students will be able to know what are we expected to be doing in this assessment? And then are the expectations also meaningful? And then the assessment also, was it given or communicated on time, so that at least you don't just tell students, for example, tomorrow we have a task, or for example, you need to do this and this, but then on a short period of time when the assessment really needed the students to prepare for that. So that is really when you're talking about an assessment to be fair. At least it's this type of treatment that you will also look at, as well as those things that you also need to look at. Is it biased to some, for example, gender, race, and then also the communication? How was the assessment communicated and on what time? Then we'll move on to flexibility. Flexibility really here, which is really looking at the flexibility either in instruction, or the flexibility either on the assessment methods that you want them to be able to do. For example, the assessment, the way you want them to respond as an assessor. So this flexibility is based on articulated consent about the appropriateness of an assessment method to the students. In a minute, what type of assessment as a lecturer are you going to give to the students? Is it really flexible? Is it really appropriate? So we have to look at in that from that perspective to say the assessment that the lecturer or the assessor is giving to the students is really appropriate. The second point is alternative assessments go beyond varying administration conditions to vary the number of other assessment dimensions. Are you just focusing on one type of assessment, for example, or on the ones that are just certain conditions that you only give, for example, assignments, but are there some variation in your assessment as well? So we also have to look at that, the flexibility of the assessor. So and then the assessment, you want students to have good or memorable learning experiences or assessment experiences. How do they respond to the assessment, for example? Do you, for example, engage students in a type of assessment where they also enjoy having those memorable learning experiences as they maybe respond to assessment? Are there some presentations that you are going to engage your students into? Are there some, for example, designing things that you want the students to design and also present to others? So at least also the flexibility in instruction and in giving assessment and learning assessment is also looks at it. How flexible is the assessor? And also, how flexible is he or she allowing the students to be able to present to respond to the assessment in different manners or in different ways. So the flexibility in the content that is also being chosen as well. Are you just focusing on, for example, we have type of assessments that just follow the traditional way of assessment. Assessment is you give an assignment or you give a task, but there are different types of standards or assessments that you can be able to use. So the content also that you're going to cover, so flexibility in the content standards chosen to be assessed. So you have to be a flexible assessor, so that at least you look at all these things. And the methods and the items that you're going to be assessed. What methods do you want? Like I alluded earlier, what methods are you going to accept, so that at least the students are can be able to have the autonomy or the choice to be able to choose how to respond to your, for example, to what you expect them to be able, because sometimes you have the learning outcomes, then how do you want the students to, can they have the autonomy, for example, to respond, to say, no, I think we are going to respond to this assessment through presentation, or we're going to through writing. So flexibility in assessment really looks at how flexible is an assessor in terms of the learning experiences, the assessment experiences that students are going to have, and then what are the type of variety of assessment that you can be able to engage the students in. So we'll move on to the next one, is reliability. When you're talking about, so look at different types of reliability, where we look at tests and retests. This is really the type of assessment or test that you give over and over. The same type of test that you give over and over. It can be on the same students or can be on different students that you assess. So maybe you might be having the same type of assessments that you give to students yearly, for example. All the first years you just design some assessment test that you give on the same it can be either the same students or different students, but it's the same type of tests on assessment. Interrate is the same test conducted by different people, different assessors. For example, the same type of test, but it's really conducted by different assessors. And then you really look at the reliability of it in a sense that at least are the, for example, results going to be different if, for example, the test was conducted or the assessment was really given by different types of assessors. And then we have parallel forms. So it's different versions of a test which are designed to be equivalent. So you're assessing the same thing, for example, the same topic or the same content, but really you are asking it in different manner. The questions are focusing on one learning, on the same learning outcomes, but the way you're asking them, maybe one is the presentation, another can be a task, another can be an assignment. So it's really different versions that you ask, but it's really focusing on the one or on the same unit that you're, for example, assessing on the same learning outcomes. And then the individual items on a test, really here we're looking at on the internal consistency, really deeply looking at what type of what are the items, what are really asking in the test that you're giving or in the assessment that you're giving. So the focus is really on the questions and the content of the assessment itself. So what are you asking in there? What are the items that are contained in your assessment? We move on to what is really the importance then of reliability. Is reliability important in assessment? Number one, is really important because it helps to analyze the results. At the moment there's consistency, then you can be able to generalize the results of the students that you get, of the group that you get, to say they performed well because there was consistency in there. Then you can be able to, the results then will be able to apply to all students. Evidence of consistent student level classification, for example, now. And like I said earlier, you can be able now to say, okay, now I think these students are at this level by looking at the assessment that you have given. So the reports then can be able to categorize on what decisions you need to make. If they performed well, do you need to go ahead? If they did not perform well, do you need to give them extra assessment, for example, so that at least they boost up their essays, or whatever type of reasons that you want to give the assessment for. Consistent score over time maintain the standard and the quality of learning. So if the moment there's a consistency in there, the consistency in assessment, the consistency in the way that you do things, at least then it maintains that standard that you've created as an assessor to say, this is the standards that I want my students to be able to do, and then this is the standard that at least I want them to be able to achieve, so that then you can be able to have that quality type of assessment that you give, because there is a standard that you have set for, and then that if you apply that standard all over and over and over, then that determines the quality. Does not mean that, okay, for these students you are giving this standard, and then other ones you're giving this type of standards. Then this question to say which standard are you really following is, and then they won't really be consistent in your assessment as well. We move on to the factors that are affecting reliability. With different types of factors that really affect reliability. The length of assessment, how long, what is the length, and then we mean by, for example, if it's a test, for example, how long is the test, or if it's an examination, how long is the examination? So we're looking at the longer the assessment really gives reliable, because students are not really given that really short time to go and rush about it and really do the assessment. So at least they're given that enough time, the ample time to really look at it and really examine it, so that at least they analyze it and then be able to tackle it and really answer the questions. The suitability of the questions asked for the students being asked. What type of questions do you use? What type of words, for example, do you use? Are you using simple words, for example, that at least the students can be able to understand? Or are you using really some of the difficult words that students may not be able to understand and may not really know what is expected of them? So the suitability of the questions really also matters. The phrase and the terminology, like I said earlier, what type of wording are you using? The consistency in test administration, for example, the length of the test, that I think that is really explained. The instructions given to the students before the test, what type of instructions did you give? Those are the things that are going to be able to affect the reliability of the assessment. The design of marking schedule, for example. The marking and the moderation of marking procedures. So that also affects, because reliability, remember we talked about it, it's really consistency. And then if really the design of the marking schedule is not really maybe clear, and so that when one marker is using it, may not really be able to perceive it or understand it in a manner that you, for example, the one that designed the marking rubric, for example, understands it. And then there won't be consistency. For example, like I said earlier, there won't be consistency. For example, we find one marker assessing and give the student 70, and then the other marker gives the student 80 or 90. Then we wonder, where's consistency here? Where's reliability here? Because then what type of criteria and standards are these assessors using? So these procedures should really be clearly identified. So the marking rubric and as well as the moderation procedures, because marking moderation procedures rather, because then you can be able to say, okay, when one is going to mark or moderate the marking, and you can be able to now look at, okay, now this type of assessment is really maybe reliable, because at least when you look at the way marking was done, the standards that has been followed. So the readiness of the students for the assessment can also be a determining factor that can affect reliability. Are they ready to take an assessment, for example, so at least their readiness, their preparedness also be able to affect how they perform, and as well as how they will then be able to take the assessment. And then environment as well. In which environment are the students going to take the assessment? What type of environment are the students going to? Is it a noisy environment? Is it a quiet environment? Maybe, for example, if it's examinations, what type of environment do they require, and how is that going to affect? You have the certain type of students, for example, that are taking an assessment, that they're writing a test that are standing. Now those ones are maybe writing a test that are sitting comfortable. How then? Obviously, then those factors will all be able to play the role in the reliability, how reliable the assessments, because they are not really given the same type of conditions that they are supposed to. So at least then the assessments may not be reliable. We move on to accountability. Accountability must really we're looking in from the perspective to say it's really holding the assessors accountable, so that at least you provide the required assessment tasks. If, for example, you just have a course to say, you may provide any type of assessments that you want. We don't have to say, okay, but because if it's a semester module, you need to give, for example, 3 assessment tasks. A year module, you need to give 6 assessment tasks or 8 assessment tasks. If there's really assessors are not, held accountable in that manner, then they can be able to, give maybe one just wants to give 12 tasks or one task, so then here accountability really looks at how do we hold assessors accountable to giving quality, number one, quality assessment, number two, required that type of assessment, so that at least they can be able to give the students an assessment, so that students can be assessed, and then they can be able to see how did they master what they need to master. This also includes accountability of assessments given to the students to test the quality of the students given by the educators. So it also does not hold accountable the students, but the assessors, but also the students being assessed. They're also going to be held accountable, because they need them to be able to take those assessments in a fairly manner. In a right manner, for example, in an ethical manner, so that at least they can be able to really demonstrate that they have really mastered what they need to master. For example, if it's examination, how are we holding them accountable, so that at least they really write an examination, and really what they're writing is really in that environment that can be really one can be able to really say that what they've written, we hold them accountable on ethical matters, so that at least what we are assessing is really what I've written is really what they know. So, and then another thing is to hold assessors accountable, ensuring the quality of assessment that is really taking place in the classroom or in the lecture halls. So what type of assessment really, either formal or informal, really taking place within the classroom. So this accountability is a two-hand fold, because it really looks at those being assessed and as well as the assessor, so that at least those two are held accountable, so that there is quality assessment taking place within the classroom, within the learning environment, can be lecture, can be online. So, and we move on to validity. Validity is really looking at the extent to which an assessment measures what its purpose is to measure. Are we assessing what really we need to assess? Are you assessing the content that you need to assess? Are you assessing the outcomes that you want to assess? So the purpose of assessments is made clearly, and then there's a criteria that you've defined, or that you explained, that you've set rather, to say this is the criteria that should be followed, and then this is the criteria that is going to be marked to be followed for marking, and then in that manner, then you really you set out a criteria that you're going to follow, and the purpose of assessing of giving that assessment. So it also looks at the method and the techniques that you're going to use. Are the assessment methods that you have chosen or that you have selected appropriate? Are they going to contribute really to help the students really demonstrate that they understand, or they demonstrate their skills on what you want them what you want to assess them on? So we come to the importance of really validity. What is validity in assessment really important? It's really important because it ensures that outcomes are assessed correctly. The learning outcomes, are they really assessed correctly? You want the learners to demonstrate, but what type of assessment are you giving them? For them, are you giving them really that type of assessment that you want the students to demonstrate, or you want the learners to be able to, the students to be able to, for example, maybe to describe, depends on what is the outcomes of the students. What is the outcome that you expect from them, and then are the type of methods that you're using really ensuring that those outcomes are reached. It also ensures that no learning outcomes left out. Validity looks at, are you really measuring everything that you're supposed to measure? Are you really assessing on every content that you're supposed to to cover? So it's really important to look at those, because you want you have set, for example, you have taught a certain topic or learning outcomes, but then are you making sure that at least that learning outcome is assessed, so that at least you know where the students are, at what level are on that learning outcomes. Also to obtain and to avoid obtaining unexpected outcomes, because the moment your assessment is valid, and remember we talked about validity is really you're assessing that what is the we're looking at the purpose of it. Why do you want to assess this? So then if you have a reason, there's a criteria, then you obviously would avoid the unexpected outcomes out of the assessment that you're giving. Yeah, because obviously when you have a certain outcome that you want, then you don't just, if you're assessing, for example, if it's mathematic, then you don't need to bring another type of content that that you do not, for example, teach, or that you not engage your students in. So unexpected outcomes is being avoided here. So that's why we make sure that at least our assessments are valid. How can we improve then validity in assessment? Uh, uh, we need to really be careful on match the assessment with learning objectives, the content, and the teaching methods. That's the teaching methods that you're going to use. The learning outcomes that you have, are they in alignment with the assessments that you're going to give to the students? Are you aligning those objectives, the content, as well as the teaching methods? It should be at least in alignment. Number two is increase the sample of objectives and content areas included in any given assessment. Increase the samples of objectives and the content. Don't be really limited. So increase those objectives so that at least the assessments will really be objective in that matter. Use assessment methods that are appropriate for the objective specified. The objective requires students to be able to demonstrate. But the assessment that you're giving them, maybe you're just it requires them to maybe, I don't know, to explain, or maybe just to list things. But then the objective, so the objective and the assessment criteria or the assessment method should be in alignment. And employ a range of assessment methods. Use different type of assessment methods. Don't just focus on one different type of assessment method that you, as an assessor, like. For example, I know I love to give tests. Then because maybe they're easy to mark or whatever. So employ different types of assessment methods so that you at least engage the students. If it's assessment, for example, this time is an assignment, the other time is a discussion, the other time is a presentation, employ different types of assessment methods. Ensure adequate security and supervision to avoid cheating in the examination. Because here, then, if there's no really supervision, especially when it comes to examinations or tests, then at least you make sure you employ those supervision so that at least they won't really be cheating. Because then if there's no supervision, for example, on examination or test, then you'll not really be able to get the results that you want, because sometimes the student may have cheated and then they will perform better, but then that is not really their competency. They just, because there was not really supervision. So employ supervision so that at least they won't be cheating in examinations or tests. Improve the reliability of an assessment, the processes that you're going to use. Reliability discussed earlier, remember, the consistency within your assessment at least. So improve that so that at least assessments can be valid. We look at different types of assessment. Different types of validity. There's face validity, and face validity is really looking at the appearance. Is really, do the assessment items appear to be appropriate? For example, that if it's an examination, the examination paper looks really to be an appropriate type of examination. The presentation of it, does it really appear to be one that is really looking at? So the items in the assessment, is it really appearing in an appropriate manner? And then content validity. The question raised is, does the assessment content cover what you want to assess? The content that you want to assess, is it really covered? If, for example, the learning outcome, is it really covered? The content that you want to assess, is it really covered in that assessment, or you just taking some parts and then maybe you do not really cover the whole content? So you look at the content validity. So you really look at, are you really assessing the content, the whole content that you really covered in that topic, for example? Criteria related to validity. How well does the test measure what you want to measure? How well do you assess that you want to assess? How well do you assess the demonstration? How well do you assess the presentation skills? So really look at what criteria are you going to use to assess those skills or those outcomes that you want them to. Constructive validity. Does the assessment, for example, measure the concepts that it really needs to be measured? So are the concepts really that you intend to measure covered in your assessment? You really want the students to be able to do A and B, are they really, so is the assessment requiring them to be able to, to do A and B that you want them to do? So that is now the construct validity, the constructs that you want them to really understand or demonstrate their understanding really measured in that. So we'll now look at factors that are affecting validity. So what are the factors that are affecting validity? There are different types of factors that are affecting validity. The teacher's competence on the subject. Because remember, assessment is, validity is focusing on how well are you assessing what you really need to assess. What is the purpose that you have of assessing, of giving that assessment? So if the teacher or the educator is not really competent in that subject, is not well versed in that subject, in that content, then he or she may not be able to provide the assessment that is really valid, that is really assessing the competency of the students. So the teachers or the educators' competencies also may affect the validity of an assessment. The availability of resources for an assessment. You want students to be able to do certain things, but then the resources that that the students may be able to use, or the resources that you would want students to use so that they will demonstrate the competence of that, may not be available. Then that will affect really the validity of the students' level. The level of the students, at what level are the students? For example, are the first years, for example, really just coming out of high school, and then maybe the type of assessment you're really giving them, really, it's not, they're not really at that level of demonstrating that competency, may also be able to affect the validity of the assessment. And the availability of time as well. What time did you, what time is allocated to that type of assessment? Do you have enough time to carry out that type of assessment? Or you just want to rush and quickly finish it up because you don't have time. And especially in higher education, the semester may be short, and you need to cover a certain range of content, and also you need to cover the type of 6 or 5 or whatever type of assessment, have an assessment that you need to cover, so that at least by the end of the semester you have covered the assessments for the students to qualify for examination. So what is the availability of time may also be able to affect the assessment, the validity of an assessment. Now let's look at the techniques. How can we then improve this? These factors are affecting validity and reliability. Assessment and marking motivation. Collaboration, especially in higher education, is really key. Even when you're just setting up of an assessment, you may find yourself that you may be for example, two lecturers that are facilitating or learning of the same module. So why don't you collaborate? So I want to give this, for example, to say, okay, now I'm going to give this type of assessment. Can you have a look at it? I want it to measure this learning outcomes. Can you have a look at it? And then your colleague or somebody that is senior will be able to say, no, I think you need to improve here. So let your work be moderated by senior colleagues or other colleagues that are well versed in your content. In that area, for example. So the assessment moderation, marking moderation is also very important in higher education. So don't just expect, because sometimes we look at it, it's just examination that needs to be moderated, but you can also be able to collaborate to say, look at my assessment methods, look at my assessment, the way I assess, is it really it's standard, for example, so that at least you're not disadvantaging the students. And collaboration in setting marking assessments, like I said earlier, like collaboration is really key in higher education. Allocating reasonable time for assessment tasks. You want students to be able to do certain things, but the time that you're allocating is, sometimes we need to be reasonable to say, can really the students be able to do this within their allocated time? And also we shouldn't really be that flexible to allocating. You want students to just write an assignment and a discussion. You're allocating, for example, 3 weeks. So at least time should be reasonable. Maybe a week or 2 or whatever. So at least as long as you allocate reasonable time, so the students at least can be able to give their best for that type of assessment. And then last, we'll look at the tips or strategies that we can ensure that you are at least in compliance with these principles of assessment. What can you do to at least make sure that we are in compliance with these principles of assessment? Number one, clearly define the assessment criteria. What do you want the students to do? The assessment should be clearly define the students' competency. So the criteria that you're setting out, should you want the students to be able to do this? This is the criteria that is set. Clearly define the criteria of the competency that you want the students to achieve. And then this includes now the skills that you want the students to have, and as well as the competence performance that you want them to do. So clearly define them, the criteria, clearly set it out. Number two, provide guidance for the assess. Provide guidance for the assessors. You may not be the one that is assessing all everything. So at least clear guidance. Assessors should have clear instructions and guidance on how to assess each criteria. Sometimes we just give an assessment, but then there isn't really a clear criteria on how the assessment is going to be assessed. This is the assessment, and then how you then later, for example, maybe this is how I want to assess. But initially, you were supposed to set out the criteria to say, this is an assessment, this is the criteria, this is the standard I want, this is the competency I want from the students. And now this is the guidance of how the assessment is going to be to be assessed. So clearly set it out. So to ensure that there is consistency and reliability, there's reliability in the outcomes, because the moment you set, for example, you've given a rubric to say this is how your work is going to be assessed, then the students are going to really tackle that assessment or that type of activity assessment according to the criteria set out, because that is you've communicated clearly how the assessment is going to be done. Consider different assessment methods, like we alluded earlier to say, don't just follow one type of assessment method that you like as an assessor. For example, I love giving tests because this, especially in higher education, or online quizzes, because now we are using technology, and quizzes helps us. With self-marking, you just give quiz and a quiz and a quiz, and then then you don't have a lot of work to mark. But then, is it really that type of effective? Is that an effective way of assessing? So use variety of assessment methods that at least will help the students demonstrate the competence that they really mastered, what you want them to master. So at least, and this also will give different experiences to students. Students don't just they don't just want to write and write. Sometimes give them something to demonstrate, to come up with something to present, and all those things. Even though the time may not be on our side, but sometimes we need to really try, so that at least we give those type of opportunities for the students to really demonstrate their competencies. So don't just be the type of assessor that gives assignments all the time or tests all the time. Use a variety of assessments, methods that you can be able to that will come to this puzzle. Use realistic scenarios, and it's really important. What good, for example, the questions comes, what good does it for you for an assessment to have a scenario that is, for example, students aren't really familiar with, or are not aligned with what's the student going to be used. There's a discussion that I think the fourth is we're discussing on the relevance of curriculum, and then they brought up this scenario to say, we were learning, we're studying the locust, for example. What relevance, does that has in our future? For example, now we are future teachers. We don't even know the relevance of that. We studied the locust and different parts of naming the locust and other things. So the relevance, the reality, is your assessment also authentic in a manner that is it really connected to the reality of the students, as well as also reality of, are they going to use it? Is it going to be useful in the future? So it should really, the assessment should really mimic the real life scenarios to help really students reflect on the industry as well as the workplace. If you're training teachers, for example, are you just giving them assessments, for example, to write notes, to write assignments, but those are going to be presented. They need to present the content. So obviously, what type of, for example, scenarios can you be able to use? Can they present, for example? Can they be if it's do they need to design something, for example teaching aids or something? So at least it should be related to the workplace, or related to something that they are going to be using in the future. Provide feedback, and feedback is really important. It's really important in assessment, because how will you know, how will the students know that this is the level that they are on, this is where they need to improve? So feedback is vital, it's a vital part of learning and assessment process, because they need to know where to improve. Sometimes we just we give 5 assessments at the same time. We're given assignment 1, assignment 2, assignment 3, and then there's no feedback. How will the students now know that they need to improve? And then it's really a challenge, especially in higher education, because you need to you have number one, we have quite large number of students, and then the time allocated semester may be short, and then you need to give all those 3 assessments, and then sometimes you even give the second assessment without finishing them, marking the first one, and then the students will repeat the same mistakes that they would have improved if you've given feedback for them in the first assessment. So we should try by all means to give feedback. You're given one assessment, you give feedback, then you give the second assessment, so that at least the students will improve from what you really need that you pointed out, and as well as it also gives you feedback to yourself to say what do I need to improve as a lecturer, for example, as an educator. So provide feedback to the students on their performance. How did they perform? They would love to hear for how they performed. You given an assignment, for example, last month, a month ago, 2 months ago, and there's no ask feedback. The students will want to know, now, how did you perform in this assessment? There's this saying to say, sometimes lecturers just give an assessment for the sake of giving. They don't really mark all of them, for example. So let's not be those type of educators that really give an assessment, assessment for the sake of giving them, but really we need to assess them, and then you give feedback, so that at least will help the students provide to improve. Because what is especially informative assessment, we need the main aim is really to improve the teaching and learning process, so that at least the students be able to learn. So this is where are my strengths, these are my weaknesses, and this is where I need to improve. So these are the references. So those are the